All right, here we go. Hey, Kathleen, thanks for volunteering or agreeing to talk about the secondary proxying to the primary feature that we've built. So I'll let you kick things off for us.
Yeah, thanks, Ampat. Sure thing. The geoproxying feature, I tried to give a bit of the backstory. I think the original reason we wanted to implement this was mostly because we've heard some of the customers that want a feature like this, and also looking through the metrics, I think we realized that people weren't really using the geosecondary web interface too much, just because it was like the experience wasn't very optimal. It was read-only, like you could only look at things, but if you had, like if you needed to write a comment in an issue or something, if you need to make any change, you'd have to go to the primary anyway. So no one really used the secondary UI. Okay. So this feature, essentially, we wanted to bring a bit more usefulness to the UI of the geosecondaries, just because we know they have the data in there, and they're also closer geographically to some of the users, to at least a subset of users. So we could just proxy traffic through that. It essentially, at the moment, I mean, we'll go into the technical details a bit more later, but at the moment it's proxying all the web traffic to the primary, except a very few specific requests like Git requests that can be served locally. But essentially the web interface, all the traffic is proceed to the primary. So there is still this kind of concern that if the secondaries are very far away and there's like network lag between them, the experience might still not be the best, just because you have to go through multiple hops, like through the secondary and then to the primary. But we are thinking it's an improvement over the previous experience, because it's read-write, but it's also an improvement because the user doesn't go directly to the primary, but it goes through that secondary site. So usually the sites would have kind of a better networking between them, rather than the user going to the primary directly from another region.
So we're not redirecting the user, we're proxying their connection to the primary. So there's no redirection happening at all from the secondary to the primary. Okay, good. That's understood. Okay, and you mentioned that we don't proxy Git requests. Could you talk a little bit more about that, and what we do and what we don't with respect to that?
Yeah. I wanted, let me see if I can find a good diagram or something just to explain that a bit easier. Just opening the docs. Can try and share my screen while I look for those. Maybe that's easier. Just a second. Share screen, desktop.
There you go.
Okay. Yeah, I don't think we have a diagram on the geo site. We have this table. Let's see if we've updated this one. Yeah, I don't think we did. I think I can talk a bit about like from this table, because this is essentially the list of things that we proxy and not proxy. So because the proxying is currently implemented in Workhorse. Let me see to get an architecture diagram as well. Yeah, so at the moment in going a bit deeper in the technical implementation of the proxying, it's currently implemented in Workhorse. So the Workhorse on the geosecondary, if it's configured as a proxying site, when the request comes in to Nginx, it will reach Workhorse, and then Workhorse will proxy directly to the primary site.
Primary site. So as far as the user is concerned, they're still connected to the secondary site. So yes, the connection terminates on this, and then another connection is established to relay the request to the primary. Is that the right way to look at it?
Technically, yeah. So the user will still see the same request, like Workhorse will initiate another request to the primary, but the user will be served the data back in the same request. So they won't see any redirect, they won't see any kind of hop directly.
Gotcha. Okay. And if the user uses, you mentioned it's all web traffic, right? So if the user uses the edit capability in the IDE to edit code, that would still go through here, even though it's potentially Git traffic. Would it still be managed through this route, right?
Yes. Yeah, it will still be proxied to the primary because it goes through Workhorse.
Okay.
Yeah. And from this table, so essentially, because we know that the geosecondary has data replicated already to it, we can kind of accelerate some of the read-only requests by serving the data locally where that is the case and where we know it's possible. So in this case, we have a table here. If you're using the web UI, that as you mentioned, that's kind of the problem. The web UI traffic is all the web UI traffic at the moment is proxied to the primary. So this would still be served by the primary. But if you're using Git, like if you're actually doing a Git clone or Git pull, if the repository exists on the secondary and we detect that it's not out of date, like it's being properly synced to the secondary, then we'll serve it directly from that secondary site instead of proxying it to the primary. Okay. We'll just short circuit the proxying in Workhorse and serve it locally instead of proxying. And that happens the same with personal snippets, which are still repositories now, since we've converted them to be repositories. If using the web UI, they will be proxy to the primary always at the moment. But if using Git, like Git clone, Git fetch, they will be served from the secondary if possible. Gotcha. Exactly the same with the group wikis. They're also repositories. And then other data types currently are still proxied. So for example, if you try to get an avatar or like an image, which is a user upload, at the moment, those are still proxied to the primary.
Okay, so if, for example, if a user uploads an image as part of a comment, that would go to the primary to be fetched still. Okay. Okay.
Yeah, I think this is something we could improve in the future and kind of try to detect whether more data types exist locally and serve them. But it's a bit more complicated for Workhorse because Workhorse doesn't really have any inner knowledge about the actual request. Like it doesn't really parse the entire request to know exactly whether I don't know, we're accessing a data type that exists and is synced to the secondary, or whether it needs to proxy to the primary, which is why at the moment we're just proxying everything to the primary.
Oh, I see. So understood. So if you could have, let's say, the uploads are available on the secondary, or some of the uploads, let's say we have an issue
Mm-hmm.
and some of the uploads are already available on the secondary, we could serve those and
Mm-hmm.
then potentially reach out to the primary to fetch the missing ones. Is that the way you're looking at this, or go?
I think that would be like an ideal scenario because
Okay,
at the moment they all go to the primary. But
they all go to the
yeah,
primary,
that's
right? Because
what I
we
think
don't
would
know
be.
what's available. Workhorse doesn't know what's available in
Yeah,
in the secondary. So
exactly.
okay.
Yeah, because at the moment Workhorse doesn't have like any kind of database connection or something. It just has a Redis connection, so it can't query the geo tracking DB to say, oh, we're accessing this file and this file exists, so I can serve it locally. Like it doesn't know that at the moment, so it just serves everything to the primary.
Okay, understood. Okay.
To the primary, yeah. And then again, with LFS objects, if you access them through the web UI, they're still gonna be proxy to the primary. It's the same idea, same concept as we discussed.
I see.
When you're using Git, it's somewhat interesting because it's still an HTTP request, but because it's a different path, like it's a Git specific path, we could bypass that. And for the LFS objects, I think we properly detect if they exist or not, and we can serve them locally, similar to the Git repositories.
So can I just pause you there, Galen? When you say we can serve them locally, if it hasn't replicated, when we serve them locally, we only serve what we have, right? So let's say the primary has a few objects that haven't been replicated. The secondary, when you access it as a user, you only see what was replicated. There's no indication that it's behind. There's no indication that the primary has extra information. What is the current experience when it comes to?
No, yeah, we actually try to. So
or do we intelligently just pull it from the primary if we don't have it on the secondary? Because we know it should exist, but it hasn't come across. So the request just gets proxied to the primary. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. So if we detect, for example, I think I actually had the code open because I was looking at earlier at a question from Slack. So we have some detection logic. Essentially, if like for Git route, we would redirect to the primary. That's a redirect for like when proxying is not used, but when proxying is used, it will redirect to a path that will proxy to the primary, if that makes sense.
Okay.
But so essentially what, yeah, sorry,
go ahead. Go ahead. Finish it.
Yeah, I was going to say, essentially the logic here was basically if we have an out of date check. So if we receive a request, I don't know, a pull or a fetch request for a specific repository, a specific LFS object, if we detect that that was not synced to the secondary or is behind the primary, we would just proxy to the primary directly instead of serving it locally, because we know it's behind and we know like the primary has a newer version, so we have to serve it from the primary.
Gotcha. And just since it was mentioned in the code there, redirect, right? Under what circumstances do we redirect, and what circumstances do we proxy?
Yeah, so I think we always redirect. It's just the thing with proxying. Let me see if I can. Where was that? Just a second. Yeah, redirect. So essentially, we'll always redirect if we need to. However, with proxying, like when proxying is enabled, so we'll redirect to a route like this, from secondary / path. And that's when like a repository is out of date, or we need to serve it from the primary. When proxying is not used, we redirect to the primary URL.
So then the user's experiences, they are directly connected to the primary at that point.
Yes, like they'll see a message in their Git clone or something. You've been redirected to primary / push from secondary / URL. When that's the case. But when proxying is used, and I think especially that's the case with unified URLs, because the URL is the same, they will be redirected to the unified URL / this path. But because they'll hit the secondary will proxy this through workhorse to the primary.
I see.
Yeah. Okay. So it's still a redirect happening, but the request is still proxy to the primary because it hits the same secondary, if that makes sense.
But in terms of where the connection is terminated from the user, if it is proxied, the connection terminates on the secondary, right? If it's redirected, then the connection actually terminates on the primary.
Exactly.
Okay, yeah. Understood. Okay, great. Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah. And then pages, it's not going to be proxied at all, just because it's a separate service altogether. So it requests to pages don't get through workhorse. They get served by the GitLab pages binary, which is separate service. So we can't really proxy those anyway, which is why we've mentioned it. But I think anyway they could use the same URL, just that access control is not supported at the moment for geosecondaries. But they could still use the same URL, and if they reach a secondary, they would still get the files because the files get replicated to the geo replication. So they would still, like pages would still work for them.
Gotcha. And since we're talking about access control here as well, could you mention, can you share how access control is managed? Is it separate for secondary and the primary, or does the kind of authentication access kind of policies all reside on the primary, and the request when you try to log into a secondary, does it get proxied to the primary?
Yeah, so with access control here, for pages it's a bit more specific. There are, I think, 3 possible types. Like you have everyone, which is kind of public. And I think you have everyone with like project members, which is essentially private.
Right.
I think you might have internal as well, like anyone logged into the instance.
But
those settings are stored in the database, so they would be replicated to secondaries anyway through the database replication. So the database, the geosecondary would know about the same access control. It's just that when the access control happens, how essentially it works is that when the request hits pages, if the user wasn't authenticated before, it needs to get redirected, like it does an auth to flow with the GitLab API, like the GitLab Rails, the actual GitLab instance.
Okay.
So on the primary that works, everything is okay, but because it's an auth to flow and it needs to like write session data, write kind of all those things, last session time, last logged in, and geosecondary database is not writable, the auth to flow would not work on a secondary, which is why access control doesn't work on secondary.
Okay.
But if like if the project is has the access control option set to everyone and it's like public, then this flow wouldn't happen and it would work. It should work on a secondary as well.
Okay. So other than pages, if you go back to projects and wikis and all that stuff, let's say I try to log into the secondary, right? What would happen how would I get authenticated? Let's say I was not authenticated. I'm coming in, I've hit the URL for the secondary, I've hit the unified URL. I end up on a secondary node.
Mhm.
what would be the authentication flow for me as a user at that point?
Yeah, so essentially I think we have a few possible types. One is the web UI, and another one is for repositories.
Okay.
So for web UI, technically, you'll have, I think this is also be different with unified URLs and with separate URLs, but let's take the unified URL case first.
Sure.
So the URL will be the same. You'll hit the secondary site, but the request will be proxy to the primary in Workhorse.
Gotcha. So it's not redirected, it's proxy back to the primary.
Yes, it's proxied.
Okay.
And because it's proxied, you get all the request headers back, like the response headers back from the primary, which means that the primary essentially sets the cookie header and sets the session header and everything. So essentially you're logging into the primary. It's just that your request to the primary is proxy to the secondary. Like you hit the secondary, but you're actually using the primary, if that makes sense.
I see. And all the session logs are written on the primary,
yes,
into the
database. Everything session related, and that is being handled by the primary because all the requests are proxy.
Gotcha. And do we log the fact that the login session was proxy? It was from a secondary, or does the primary just handle that as I just logged in?
Yeah, good question. I don't think we log that. So what we do is we generate like a metric when a user is logged in through the secondary directly, but I don't think we do that on login, like on the actual login.
Okay.
That's a good idea though.
Cool. That's really interesting.
Yeah, and for repositories, it's also very similar in that, yeah, it's similar, but it's also a bit different because we need to figure out whether we can serve data locally for repositories, which is why it's different. So the authentication actually happens on the secondary.
Okay.
So let's say you do a git clone user password at GitLab instance.com. And you hit the secondary. Let's say this is a unified URL. And the secondary will verify your user and password with what's in the database or your token, whatever you use to authenticate.
Okay.
And if, let's say, the repository is there, we just serve it locally, we serve it back, we don't send anything to primary. If the repository doesn't exist, or I don't know, it's out of date and we need to proxy to the primary, we'll proxy the request as is to the primary, which means the primary will verify the credentials as well.
Okay, so I'm just thinking this through. Sorry, bear with me. You hit the secondary. It means the secondary has everything it needs to authenticate that user.
All the data should be in the database. Yeah.
What about logging? Do we not log the SSH sessions in the same way we log the web sessions?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think we do like normal logging, like actual file-based logging. I don't think we can log them in the database because the database is read-only.
Sure. So at that point, those logs will only be on the secondary.
Yes.
Okay. All right. So, okay, great. So username and passwords get replicated to the secondary. And so the second is that, I just confirm, I want to confirm my understanding is they get, whatever authentication mechanism it is, that also SSH keys get
yes.
pulled
they're
across?
Also in the database, so they also get replicated from the primary.
Gotcha. So the secondary has everything it needs to authenticate to get request. Yeah. Okay. Fair.
Cool. And that's for the data types. About limitations, I think we've talked a bit about this. Essentially, Pages is a separate service, and non-Rails requests, like we can't proxy them just because we implemented the proxy at the workhorse level, which means Pages can be proxied, but it should also use like a separate domain because that's a requirement. But it also means like the container registry cannot be proxied either. So if you try to do like a Docker pool or something for an image, you can't use a unified URL for that, because if you push an image to the secondary, let's say, that would not work. So you need to use like either a separate domain or use different domains in GitLab.
Okay, but would you want to? Sorry, let me just confirm my understanding. You're saying you could push a container image to the GitLab, the secondary.
You can't. I think
right?
put the route. Yeah, I'm not 100% sure, but if it would not a route, it would be removed just because it's not. We don't replicate it to the primary. Replicate from the primary. If that makes sense.
Gotcha. Okay, so yeah, okay, that makes sense. I think I misunderstood. So you can't push anything to the secondary, because then obviously that data is not tracked properly, won't get replicated. So okay, great.
Yeah,
we can get into those later. I think I'd like to understand a little bit more about those limitations.
Yeah, and I think with Humanities it works kind of the same way, in that it still uses workhorse, and proxying is still implemented from at the workhorse level. So as long as we have a proper URL set for the primary, the secondary would know how to proxy it, even if it's Kubernetes or not. What else about the unified URLs specifically? Because we didn't talk much about it. Essentially, before all the proxying work, you'd always have separate URLs for the geosecondaries. So the primary would just have to live at primary test URL, and then each secondary would be at a different one. With proxying, this can be easier. Like we can make it work with unified URL just because the requests are proxied to the primary, and kind of everything in the web UI happens to the primary. So we could have a single URL for all the secondaries as well, and it should just work.
Okay.
And what we're kind of hoping to enable as well is to have separate URLs. So for folks that were still using the previous configuration where they had like separate domains, I'm not 100% sure. Like we've talked about it a bit, but we didn't really find like a good use case where someone would prefer to have separate domains for the geosecondaries. But I don't know, it could be just preference.
Okay. Yeah, I think some customers do want to, for example, from build farms, I think customers would want to make sure that the pulls are happening from their secondary, for example. And is that possible when you have a unified URL? Can you force the connection down to the secondary even though the URL? Do you have static routes and things like that set up in order to force it through? Yeah,
at the moment. So if you have unified URLs, the only way to force to a specific kind of secondary would be at the DNS level. Let's say either, I don't know, use like a location aware DNS that could route specific IPs or specific locations to a secondary that you want.
Gotcha.
Or you could just override it yourself manually if you don't have like access to the DNS settings, for example.
Mm-hmm.
You could override it yourself in like etc host or something, just to point it to the IP of a secondary directly.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah. And with separate URLs, technically, this would work as before. It's just that when using the web interface, the requests would be proxied to the primary instead of being served locally as before.
Gotcha.
Let's see what else.
So we also have secondary mimicry, I believe. Is that the right term I'm using?
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think it's kind of the same concept. I mean, that's what it started out. Let me see if I can find the epic for that.
Yeah, there was a separate epic for that. I just wanted to understand if there was any subtleties or nuances with that.
Yeah, I think this is more like the high-level epic that we discussed before actually going to the implementation. It was like the idea that the secondary should act as a primary in one way or another. And that one way ended up being proxying.
I see.
In our case. Yeah.
Okay. Great. All right. I don't have any other questions. I do. Gitly and how it interacts with your proxying. Could you talk a little bit about how that might work when Gitly is deployed both on primary and secondary sites in an HA architecture?
Yeah. Technically, the kind of interface, the only way to reach Gitly would be through GitLab Workhorse or GitLab Shell. And then GitLab Workhorse is essentially the web UI. So if we proxy the request, it will not reach the secondary Gitly at all. Like it would go directly to the primary.
Always.
For web requests, at least.
For web requests, gotcha. Okay.
Yeah. For web requests, it would go actually through Puma, which serves the web request, like the web interface, and like it will go to the Puma of the primary, and that will hit the primary.
Right.
But for Git requests, like if you do a Git clone over HTTP, here is where, like in Workhorse, is where we will check if
it's available locally.
Yeah, like if we check with the local Rails API if it's available locally, if it's synced, like if it's not out of date, and so on. And if that's the case, then we will connect directly to the secondary Gitly and serve the data back.
Okay.
I see. But from that perspective, yeah, nothing exactly should change. And it's the same for GitLab Shell. That's just for SSH, for Git over SSH operations. With GitLab Shell, again, if we'll go to Workhorse and Rails to double check if repository exists and is up to date and so on. And if it is, then we'll just contact the local Gitly. And if it's not, we'll initiate proxying through Rails, which is one of the open issues that we have. Because if you do a proxy over SSH push, like if you have a large push, and it needs to be proxied to the primary because you can't push to a secondary, then this proxying would happen in the Puma, at the Puma level, which means 60 seconds timeout.
I see. Right.
Yeah, so we have an open issue at the moment to kind of rethink the approach, possibly move the proxying, like the Git over SSH proxying to Workhorse as well. So there is no like strict timeout for that.
I see. So in normal setup, when it's not being proxied, the push would come to Git shell. Git shell would talk to Gitly, and that would not involve Puma in that case, right? And that's why the push doesn't time out. But when you
in a non-geo environment, like if you push to the primary, it would go GitLab shell Gitly. It will go there.
GitLab shell Gitly, right? Yeah. In a proxy, in a secondary scenario, it would hit GitLab shell. GitLab shell will talk to the workhorse. It would check with workhorse. You would see that this is not possible to push onto the secondary. So workhorse wouldn't proxy it. It would get pushed to Rails or Puma.
Yes,
Puma
because essentially, so all the checks happen in Puma because workhorse can't really, doesn't know specifically about the data types. So, and it also doesn't have a database connection. So it needs to do all those checks in Puma. And at this point, if the repository is if we need to push and anything, it would happen from Puma to the primary side.
I see. So we couldn't kind of create a job for workhorse once we know what needs to be done so that it can complete the push.
No, it's synchronous.
I see. Gotcha. Okay, right. And so just to complete the story there, Puma would talk to Gitly directly on the primary node. So the connection would go GitLab shell to work on the secondary, GitLab shell to workhorse to Puma to Gitly on the secondary, primary. That's where it will go straight.
It would actually, no, so it would actually go because
it needs to come through the outer
so
piece.
Even if that's the kind of edge case. Even if you do a git SSH push to the secondary, it will end up as a git HTTP push on the primary because we use the API of the primary, like the internal kind of geo API of the primary to do the git operations.
Okay. So then in that case, we bypass Gitly on the primary.
No, we bypass GitLab shell, so we don't reach GitLab shell, but it still ends up with Gitly because Gitly is the one that handles all the Git data.
Gotcha. So it would come through HTTPS, Nginx, workhorse. So instead of hitting GitLab shell, we bypass that, get in there, and then workhorse would push it to Gitly as well. Okay. Gotcha. Okay, that would make sense. All right.
Awesome.
Good. It might be a good idea to draw some of these diagrams out. It would be quite insightful actually to see the logic happening.
I think we need to have a bit more specific ones for proxying.
I think
so many kind of edge cases.
I think it'll certainly be useful to see how the data flows in case there's a need to troubleshoot these issues for someone who isn't as familiar as, for example, yourself with the code. A diagram might help understand where things are moving to. But yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
Great. That was a really good session. I don't have any questions at the moment. Any more questions? Thank you very much, Kathleen. Really appreciate it. Anything you want to talk about to wrap up the session?
Not really. I think we've covered a bit. There are probably still things that we could go through, but I didn't really have an agenda. So
we'll leave those for another session. Let's do a follow-up session for anything we haven't covered so far. But this is a great intro. So thank you.
Awesome. Thanks.
Let me stop the recording.